We're talking about Flame 2018 and the main themes. Very pleased to say with me now is Professor Jonathan Stern, Distinguished Research Fellow from the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan. I've heard so many different words today to describe the market. I've heard volatile, exciting, interesting. How would you sum up the market at the moment?
Optimistic after several years of much less optimistic development. So people here are cheerful this year, and they were a little bit cheerful last year, but this year they're seriously cheerful.
I've heard a lot of people though saying that the growth in Asian demand sort of expected, but a lot more than anyone possibly anticipated.
Well, in Asia, certainly in China, we had much more growth than we were expecting, which created a little tiny problem over the winter as prices went up. But this is a much better problem to have than what we had in the early 2010s, which was the opposite and made everybody very, very sad.
Yeah, well, certainly one way of putting it. All right, challenges ahead then, because it's not all plain sailing.
In Europe, the big challenge ahead really is from where are we going to get our supply? We've got two big sources of supply, Russia and LNG. We've got a serious situation in the Netherlands where we're looking at a very rapidly declining supply. We've got Norway stable, we've got the UK slowly declining, but we were hoping to have new sources from the Southern Gas Corridor, maybe from the Middle East, maybe even from domestic shale gas. That's not going to happen, or at least not in any large quantities very soon. And that's a disappointment, and so we have to manage a supply situation which could get tricky, particularly over a cold winter.
Okay, well, where do you think that supply will come from then? Because you mentioned LNG, exactly where from? Where will Europe be importing it from?
Well, you know, this is not something that we can predict because LNG is becoming a global market. So people talk about, oh, LNG will come from the US. Well, maybe it will, but only if that's the most profitable place for LNG sellers in the US to land their LNG. My feeling is that we'll probably get quite a lot of our LNG from the Middle East. Maybe some of it will come from Norway, maybe some of it will come from elsewhere. With a global market, it actually matters much less where you get your LNG from. It's not like pipeline gas where you've got a fixed pipeline, you know where it's coming from. So the key thing is that we get enough of it and we get it when we need it.
So looking at that then, you're suggesting we're going to see more short-term contracts, I'm guessing?
We are going to see more short-term contracts, and that means probably short-term pricing, and that means more of a liquid market, which will be good, but then we come back to our friend volatility. And that of course means that when you have very cold weather, like we did for a few days in March, you'll see that price shoot up.
Yeah. Sorry, Gunn, you were going to say.
And that's right, that's exactly what should happen in a market. But people then get very, very nervous because they like market pricing when it's low, but when it's high, they don't like it so much.
No, so, and how do you also make sure that those selling it are getting the decent return that they need to be reinvesting higher up the supply as well?
Well, that's really a hard question for people with new projects, because what we can say to them is, look, there are periods when you're going to earn quite a lot of money, and there are periods when you may not earn very much money. And their response is, well, I can't finance a project on that, you've got to give me more certainty. And in the market we have, we're not going to be able to give them more certainty. They're going to have to take more risk. And they and their financiers will not really want to do that.
No, indeed. What sort of balance of energy do you see then in Europe?
Well, I mean, I believe Europe's moving towards a gas and renewables energy balance. In other words, I think coal will gradually phasing out. In some countries it'll take longer. I don't believe nuclear will have a big renaissance. You know, there'll be the odd project here and there. Oil will remain in the transportation sector until it's replaced by something else. But I think we're going to see a gas and renewables energy balance in most countries, and then it'll really depend on things like development of battery storage, whether we can get renewable heat, which is much more complicated than renewable power. And so we're going to move into a much more innovative and technologically based energy sector.
All right, well, should we talk about storage?
Right.
Because that
Yep.
is, particularly when you have, you know, all the seasonal differences,
Yep.
when you're factoring all of that in, you're trying to keep the prices stable. it's all about storage.
It is all about storage, and it's particularly the case where you're in the northern hemisphere, where you've got cold, dark winters, so you may not have wind blowing, you may not have any sun, and you've got to keep people's homes warm and supplied with electricity. And that's tricky. It's much less difficult in the southern hemisphere, where you've got much more sun and probably more wind as well. So this is difficult for Europe, and we are really relying on new technology. Many of us believe that we will get that technology, but we won't get it for another couple of decades.
Is there enough money, do you think, going into that technology? Is that the problem, the actual R&D there?
It may be R&D, but even once we have the R&D, if you think about the millions of homes in most European countries and how we have to change the technology of energy in each of those homes, we may be talking about having to go into each home and say to people, yes, we're going to replace your whatever you've got with this technology. And of course, people may not react well to that.
No, indeed. And if you're talking replacing with some form of gas, maybe there's the public perception, which also then needs the public education of actually where that gas is coming from, and just a bit more about the backstory.
It probably won't be, gas is in a lot of homes. What we'll be talking about is replacing gas probably with either hydrogen or a heat pump. And the issue there is people are not familiar with these technologies. With a heat pump, they're going to have to find more room for it. It's going to displace maybe something in their garden, maybe something in their house. With hydrogen, they're not familiar with hydrogen. If you are of a certain age in the UK, like me, you can remember town gas, which was to a large extent hydrogen, and then we switched to natural gas. We may have to switch again to hydrogen. But again, you're going to have to change boilers, or at least burners in boilers. You're going to have to change some appliances. So you're actually being very intrusive in people's homes, albeit on a technological level.
It is, but it's a one-on-one then, isn't it?
It really is absolutely one-on-one.
Jonathan, we've not mentioned a lot about politics and the effect that politics can have on this entire industry, the market, the shape of the market. And politics can be very volatile and very difficult to predict. And I just wonder what your thoughts were and what you're looking to at the moment there.
Well, one of the big problems for gas is the problems between Russia and Europe at the moment. And people tend to associate everything to do with Russia with President Putin. But they don't like President Putin. Some are afraid of what he might do post-Crimea, one or two other things. The problem is we are very dependent on Russian gas, and we see us becoming, in Europe, if anything, even more dependent on Russian gas. That is going to create political strains, because the difficulty is politicians want to make speeches about, well, we need to become less dependent on Russian gas, but they don't tend to understand the difficulties of supply that we talked about a little bit earlier. And that's where we're struggling. Nobody wants to import Russian gas because they like President Putin. People are importing Russian gas because it's competitive and because there aren't any other equally competitive sources. Now, if Russian gas gets to a much higher level, that, I think, is going to create a political problem for gas.
Do you mean at a higher price level?
No, a higher level in terms of percentage dependence of Europe on Russian gas.
Right.
And that is, I can imagine politicians in the big European countries saying, we're uncomfortable with this level of Russian gas. And if that was to happen, then that would be a significant problem for gas and might hasten a transition to something else.
Would you then put LNG into the mix, maybe from America? Because the States, it would seem, a lot of that is now going to the Asian market.
Well, LNG is already in the mix.
Yeah.
The question is, what should we do if, just for competitive reasons, our level of Russian gas imports continues to increase and LNG goes elsewhere?
Yeah.
Do we need to do something politically inspired, different to that? Our market structure makes that very difficult. So it's more likely that governments will say, no, we probably need to limit the share of gas in our energy balances. And that, again, will probably, if that was to happen, that would enhance the transition, which is already underway, away from fossil fuels. But the key thing is, if that happens in the 2020s, that would be earlier than we in our institute currently think, which is that most of the big transition will be in the 2030s and beyond.
Beyond that. Jonathan, let's just say we're standing here this time next year talking. Right. What do you think will be on our list of things to talk about?
I think top of our list this time next year will be the fact that we've got a lot more LNG in the global market, and possibly the share of Russian gas will have gone down because we'll have more LNG in Europe.
Yeah, well, we will find out.
We certainly shall.
Jonathan, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks.